They locked her away to hide her beauty, until the Alpha King found her. The first thing Serafina ever remembered being told was to stay out of sight. She was 6 years old when her father brought home a new wife. The woman's name was Claudette, and she wore expensive perfume and smiled with only her mouth. She had 2 daughters of her own, Portia and Lenora, both of them pretty in the way of carefully arranged dolls. When Claudette looked at Serafina for the very first time, something shifted in her eyes. Not warmth. Not dislike either, not quite yet. It was closer to recognition, the kind a person feels when they see something that threatens them without being able to say exactly how. Serafina's father, Gerald, was a quiet and tired man. He had loved his first wife deeply, and when she died, he had folded in on himself like paper left in the rain. He remarried not because he had healed but because he did not know how to raise a daughter alone. He told himself Claudette was kind. He said this to himself so many times and with such consistency that he began to believe it, and somewhere along the way he stopped looking closely enough to discover whether it was actually true. The rules came slowly at first, which was how Claudette walked, not in dramatic gestures, but in the patient, quiet accumulation of small restrictions that felt reasonable one by one and were suffocating in their total. Serafina was told not to sit at the front of the room when guests came. She was told her dresses were too noticeable, and they were replaced with plain gray and brown things that made her appear smaller than she was. She was told to eat in the kitchen when important people visited. She was told her laugh was too loud. She was told her questions were the sort that embarrassed a family like theirs. She was told there was something about her that unsettled people, though no one could say precisely what that something was. By the time she was 12, she had heard these things so many times that she had stopped questioning them. She had come to believe them with the dull, weary certainty of someone who has been told the same story in the same serious voice for so many years that it has simply become the air they breathe. She had stopped asking why. Asking made things worse. Silence was always safer. She learned to move through the house like a shadow, early mornings before anyone woke, late evenings after everyone had gone to their rooms. She found the garden by accident one gray afternoon while looking for a place to cry where no one would hear her. It was at the back of the estate, half forgotten, overgrown, thick with roses that had not been cut or tended in years. She sat down in the middle of all that wild, unkempt growth and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that the world was not entirely hostile to her. The garden became hers. She tended it with the same quiet faithfulness with which she approached everything, carefully, without expecting to be noticed or thanked for the work she put in. The roses began to bloom again. The stone path beneath the weeds revealed itself, gray and solid and real. She planted lavender along the far wall because it grew even when no one cared for it, and she admired that quality enormously. She planted climbing vines across the old iron trellis near the back wall because she liked the way they reached for something even when the something was far above them. She did not know, then, that she was learning the thing she would eventually build her whole life around. She only knew that the garden listened without judging, and that was more than almost anyone inside the house ever offered her. When she was 15, her father died. It happened quickly, a heart condition that had gone undetected for years, a hospital stay that lasted 3 days, and then a silence in the house that was different from all the silences she had lived through before it. Serafina stood at his graveside in the brown dress she hated and held her hands clasped in front of her and did not cry, not because she felt no grief but because she had spent so many years being told that her feelings were inconvenient that she no longer trusted herself to express them in public. After Gerard died, the rules stopped being subtle. Claudette dismissed nearly all of the household staff except for one elderly woman named Bridget, who cooked and cleaned and kept her eyes carefully down and asked no questions. Portia and Lenora went to the private girls' school in town, came home each afternoon with shopping bags and stories and the comfortable noise of people who moved through the world without obstacle. They treated Serafina with the bored contempt of 2 people who have been told they are better than someone and have chosen, quite easily, to believe it. Serafina was not enrolled in any school. When a neighbor once asked Claudette about this directly, Claudette lowered her voice and shook her head with a slow, practiced sadness and explained that Serafina had a condition. A fragile nervous temperament. She needed rest. She could not manage ordinary life the way other girls could. The neighbor looked sympathetic. She patted Claudette's arm. She did not ask again. Serafina was 17 when the lock appeared on her bedroom door. It was not a padlock, nothing so obvious, nothing that could not be explained away. It was a small, heavy bolt, mounted on the outside of the door frame, the kind you might use to secure a storage room or a cellar. Claudette installed it herself one morning while Serafina was in the garden. That evening, when Serafina came inside and walked down the corridor to her room, she heard the bolt slide home from the outside. She stood in the middle of the small room and listened to the sound of Claudette's heels clicking away down the corridor, growing quieter and then disappearing. She stood there for a long time without moving. Then she went to her desk, reached beneath the loose floorboard, and took out the notebook she kept hidden there. She opened it to a new page and wrote down what had just happened. She wrote it plainly and without dramatic language, in the careful handwriting she had taught herself from old books on the shelves in her room. She had filled 6 notebooks this way over the years, recording days and observations and small things she wanted to remember. She wrote because it was the one activity in her life that made her feel that her thoughts belonged entirely to her and to no one else. The window in her room looked out over the estate gate. She could see the narrow country lane beyond it, and sometimes, in the early mornings, a jogger or a cyclist moving along it. She began to spend more time at that window. Not with any dramatic feeling of longing, she had learned to keep longing very small and very quiet. She watched because the world outside continued to move, and there was something in that ordinary fact that steadied her. Cars went somewhere. People went somewhere. The lane curved to the left beyond the gate post, and she could never see where it led, but she knew it led somewhere, and on the hard days that small certainty was enough. Bridget was the only person who spoke to her with real regularity. She was a compact woman in her late 60s who moved around the kitchen with unhurried certainty and smelled of flour and kept a small wooden cross around her neck. She brought Serafina her meals through the locked door each day, and sometimes she would linger for a moment at the threshold and say something gentle about the weather, or about a bird she had seen on the kitchen windowsill that morning. She never said anything about the lock. She never said anything about Claudette. But she always looked at Serafina with an expression that was not pity, it was closer to sorrow, the kind that lives in a person who understands that some situations are beyond their power to change and who has accepted that this does not make them hurt any less. One morning in early spring, Serafina was standing at her window when she heard a sound she did not recognize. Not the usual quiet rumble of farm vehicles or the sedans that occasionally use the lane. This was heavier. Multiple vehicles, moving together, in deliberate formation. She pressed her hand against the cold glass and looked out. A line of black cars moved slowly along the lane beyond the gate. They were polished and silent and carried a kind of seriousness that did not belong on a country road. The formation slowed. She could not see why. There was a stillness about it that felt chosen rather than accidental, purposeful rather than mechanical. She watched until the cars moved on and the lane was quiet again. Then she turned back to her room, sat at her desk, and wrote down what she had seen. She wrote it the same way she wrote everything, because it had happened, and it was real, and she was still here to record it. She did not know that one of those cars carried the most powerful man in the country. She did not know his name. She did not know what he looked like or why he was on that road or why the formation had slowed. She only knew that something unusual had passed by her window, and that in a life defined by the absence of anything unusual, even that was worth writing down. That night she lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her, and she felt something that was unfamiliar enough that it took her a long time to name. It was not happiness. It was not hope in the bright, forward-leaning sense. It was the feeling of waiting, but not the hollow waiting she had learned to endure, the waiting of someone who does not believe anything is coming. This was different. This was the kind of waiting that arrives when you have seen the first grey light before sunrise and know, even without proof, that the sun is going to rise. She turned onto her side, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and let the feeling stay. Outside, the garden was dark and still, and the roses she had planted were already beginning to bud, because things that are meant to grow will find their way to growing even in the most difficult ground. The first morning after the convoy passed, Serafina woke earlier than usual. She lay still in the half-dark of her room and listened to the house, the way she always did. Reading it silences the way other people read words on a page. The corridor was quiet. The clock in the hall had not yet struck 6. Claudette would not rise for another hour. Portia and Lenora would sleep until at least 8. Only Bridget would be up, moving quietly through the kitchen with the unhurried certainty of someone whose body performs the morning routine without consulting the mind. Serafina got up. She dressed in the plain clothes she had been given, a beige shirt, trousers that were too large at the waist and held with a length of cord she had found in the garden shed, and she went to her desk. She opened her notebook and read the entry from the night before. The convoy. The black cars. The deliberate stillness. She read it twice. Then she closed the notebook and went to her window. The lane was empty. Mist lay low over the field on the far side. There was nothing there. Then the sound came. The same engine, no, several engines together, that heavy, measured rumble of vehicles that did not belong on a country road. She turned back so quickly she knocked her elbow hard against the desk and felt the sharp sting of it but did not stop moving. She pressed both hands flat against the glass and looked out. The black cars were there again. In almost exactly the same position as the day before, just beyond the estate gate. She could not see inside the tinted windows. She could not make out faces or detail. She could only see the formation, 5 vehicles, precisely spaced, entirely still in a way that felt deliberate. And then the rear door of the middle car opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, with dark hair and the kind of face that had been shaped by difficult decisions and the particular exhaustion of responsibility. He was dressed simply, a dark coat, nothing on it to indicate rank or office. He had not brought anyone with him out of the car. He stood on the lane beside the estate gate and looked through the iron bars, and then he looked up. He looked directly at the window where she was standing. She did not move back. She could not have explained, afterward, whether this was courage or simply the paralysis of someone who has not been looked at in so long that they have forgotten how to respond to it. She stood at the glass and looked down, and he stood on the lane and looked up, and neither of them moved for a moment that seemed to expand beyond its own edges. He raised one hand. Not a wave exactly. More of an acknowledgement, the gesture of a person who has noticed they are not alone and wants the other person to know that they have been seen. Serafina exhaled slowly. She did not wave back. She was not sure the gesture still belonged to her. She simply stood there, her breath making a small circle of fog on the cold glass, and she let herself be seen. After a moment, he lowered his hand. He looked at the gate for a few more seconds, then turned and returned to the car. The convoy resumed its movement, and in less than a minute it was gone, the lane empty again, the mist closing quietly behind it. She stood at the window long after the sound had faded. She thought about the way he had looked up. She thought about the fact that he had looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, with the focused attention of someone who has noticed something worth noticing. He had not looked away with embarrassment. He had simply looked, and acknowledged, and remained. She was not accustomed to being worth noticing. She went back to her desk and sat with her hands flat on the wood surface and looked at the grain of it, the familiar scratches and stains, and tried to understand what she was carrying in her chest. It was not excitement. It was more careful than that, more guarded. It was the feeling of someone who has been given a single small thing after a long absence of anything and is holding it very gently because they are not yet sure whether it will hold. She decided to be careful with it. 3 days passed. The lane stayed empty. Bridget brought meals and said small, kind things and left. Claudette did not unlock the door except to pass in a pile of mending, clothing belonging to Portia and Lenora, and to remind Serafina that idleness was ingratitude wearing a comfortable dress. Serafina took the mending and did it without speaking, and the days moved past in their usual way. On the 4th morning, she heard the boat slide open before Bridget arrived. She sat up in bed. The door did not open immediately. There was a pause long enough to make her wonder if she had imagined the sound, and then the door swung inward. Standing in the doorway was a woman she had never seen before, perhaps 40, with close-cropped silver hair and the alert, watchful expression of someone who asks questions professionally and listens to the answers with real attention. "My name is Caroline," the woman said. "I work for the government. I am here to ask you some questions, and I would like you to feel free to answer them honestly. No one will be in any difficulty for what you tell me." Serafina looked at her. She looked at the open door behind her. She thought about the boat that had been on the outside of that door since she was 17. She thought about the lane. She thought about the man who had looked up at her window. "The garden," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Caroline stepped back from the doorway without comment. Serafina got up, dressed, walked through her own door without anyone stopping her, down the corridor she had not been permitted to walk freely for months, through the kitchen where Bridget stood at the sink with her back carefully turned, and out through the rear door into the morning. The light hit her face. It was cool and clear and came without condition or warning, and she closed her eyes for just one moment to take it in, the way you close your eyes when something is almost too large to receive all at once. Then she opened them, walked to the bench beside her roses, and sat down. She answered every question Caroline asked her. She answered them with the plain, precise honesty of someone who has been alone with the truth for so long that pretending is no longer an option they can locate inside themselves. She told her about the boat. She told her about the mending. She told her about the notebooks. She told her about the years before the boat, when the walls were not iron but were no less real for that. When the questions were finished, Caroline thanked her and stood up to leave. "What happens now?" Serafina asked. Caroline looked at her for a moment. "The right things," she said. Serafina sat in the garden after she left. She sat among the roses she had grown from cuttings and the lavender that grew because it refused not to, and she pressed her palms flat against the stone bench and held the warmth of the morning sun that had found its way over the estate wall, and she breathed, and she waited, and for the first time in longer than she could name, the waiting did not feel entirely empty. The investigation was quiet and thorough, the way the most important things usually are. Caroline's team worked with methodical care. They spoke to the postman who had noticed for years that the estate's rear occupant never collected her own mail. They found the retired school administrator who had repeatedly flagged Serafina's absence from enrollment records and received, in return, responses on official-looking letterhead, later confirmed to have been fabricated, describing a rare chronic condition requiring complete home rest. They located a former estate gardener named Arthur, who had been let go more than a decade earlier and who, when reached by telephone, went very quiet for a long time before he said that he had always wondered that there was a young girl he used to see in the back garden, and that he had thought about her on and off for years without knowing what to do. The legal documents were the most significant part of it. Claudette had produced, over many years, an entire paper history, guardianship agreements, medical assessments bearing the signature of a doctor who had subsequently lost his license for entirely unrelated reasons, correspondence with fictional distant relatives confirming that Serafina was receiving appropriate family care at home. It was a detailed, patient, long-running construction. The kind that required not a single dramatic act but a sustained willingness to maintain a lie across time, across documents, across the small social interactions where it might otherwise have unraveled. When the folder reached King Alexander Dravik's desk on a Thursday morning, he read it from the first page to the last without stopping. He was 34 years old, and he had run the country for 6 years, and he had built his professional reputation on being measurably difficult to move. His advisors called it his greatest asset, the ability to receive even the most serious information without showing visible reaction, to process it in whatever interior space he kept for the difficult things and return with a response that was measured and actually useful. His counsel valued it. It made him steady in every crisis they had faced. It made him, some of his more private acquaintances admitted to each other, almost impossibly difficult to reach as an ordinary human being. His personal aide, a young man named Oliver who had worked beside him for 3 years, had never seen the king drum his fingers or cross and uncross his arms or perform any of the small physical signs by which ordinary people signal that something has gotten under their skin. Oliver was standing near the window when Alexander read the folder. He watched and said nothing. He noticed that the king stopped turning pages at a certain point and simply sat, perfectly still, with his eyes fixed on the middle distance, for almost a full minute before he continued reading. When he reached the end, He closed the folder with care and set it squarely on the desk and looked out through the tall window at the city below, which was going about its ordinary Thursday morning with complete ignorance of what had just been placed in this room. Oliver thought about asking something. He decided against it. Alexander said, without turning from the window, "Get me Caroline." Oliver left to make the call. While he waited, Alexander remained at the window. He was thinking about the morning on the lane. He had been returning from a site visit to a property the government was assessing for infrastructure use. The convoy had slowed for road maintenance, and he had looked up from the document he was reading and seen, through the tinted glass, a face at an upper window of an estate on the left side of the road. He had seen faces in windows 100 times. He had not stopped the car for any of them. He could not have explained, even to himself, what was different about this one. She was not looking at the convoy with curiosity or excitement. She was simply watching it pass, with the still, level attention of someone who has learned to observe the world from a safe distance. There was no performance in it. No awareness of being observed, no adjustment for the possibility of an audience. She was simply, completely, entirely herself, and there was something in that quality, in that absolute absence of performance, that he had not been able to set aside once he had seen it. He had told his driver to stop. His head of security had reminded him that they were 12 minutes behind schedule. He had told him to stop again. He had stepped out of the car because something in him required it, though he could not have explained the feeling to anyone without sounding unlike himself. She had not moved when she saw him. She had not startled or withdrawn or looked away with the embarrassment that most people showed when they were caught watching something they were not sure they had the right to watch. She had simply looked back at him with those still, serious eyes, and the quality of that looking had stayed with him through the rest of the day and into the evening, lodged somewhere in him like a splinter that does not hurt enough to require attention but that you are always vaguely aware of. He had asked Oliver to find out who lived on that estate. He had not expected this. Caroline arrived within 40 minutes and sat across the desk from him and answered his questions with the direct, unornamented precision that he valued in her. The situation was exactly as the folder described it. The investigation was thorough and the evidence was solid. The legal path forward was clear. "I want to go to the estate," he said, when she had finished. "Your schedule has a window tomorrow morning at 9, she said. I anticipated this. He looked at her. "Is there anything that needs to be prepared beforehand?" "Pauline from the legal office will prepare the formal documentation tonight," Caroline said. "I would recommend a small party. No press, no communications advance notice. Clean and quiet." "Good," he said. He arrived at the estate the next morning in a single car, one security vehicle following, no fanfare and no statement prepared. When he stepped out onto the gravel drive, he did so with the uncomplicated purposefulness of someone who has made a decision and is proceeding to carry it out. Claudette answered the door herself. She had been told the previous day that a government representative would visit regarding administrative matters. She had dressed with care and arranged her expression into the practiced warmth she maintained for occasions when she needed to perform graciousness. When she opened the door and saw Alexander, the warmth flickered for a fraction of a second before she reassembled it. She extended her hand and said something carefully composed about what an honor it was. He shook her hand briefly and walked past her into the hallway. Pauline, the legal officer, began to speak in the calm, informational tone of a person who has delivered difficult news so many times that she has stopped confusing urgency with volume. She outlined what the investigation had established. She named the documents and the witnesses. She cited the applicable law. She described what Claudette was now required to permit. She said all of this with the steady delivery of someone reading from a clear and well-organized document. Claudette began to speak over her. She produced a file from the hall table drawer, had clearly positioned it there in preparation, and opened it and laid it out and stepped back and invited them, with great composed dignity, to examine the evidence for themselves. She spoke of the lengths she had gone to. She spoke of sacrifice and care and the difficulty of managing someone as complicated as Serafina. She spoke for nearly a minute, building her case with the practiced fluency of someone who has maintained a particular story for long enough that they have come to believe it themselves. Then she stopped. Alexander had not moved. He had not spoken. He had not looked at the fire. He had simply stood in the hallway and listened with the still, even attention of a person who has already decided and is allowing the other person the time they need to finish speaking. Claudette looked at him. The composed expression held, but it had developed a slight, telling strain around its edges. He said, "Where is Serafina?" Claudette said that she was resting. That she required rest. That interrupting her rest was, medically speaking, inadvisable and potentially. "Where is she?" he said again. The same volume. The same tone. It was not raised. It did not need to be. Bridget, who had been standing quietly in the kitchen doorway since the moment the visitors arrived, turned and walked down the corridor toward the back of the house without anyone directing her to do so. 2 minutes passed. Then the back door opened, and Serafina came in from the garden. She was wearing a beige shirt and the cord-belted trousers. Her dark hair was loose. There was soil on her hands from where she had been walking among the roses. She stopped in the doorway to the kitchen and looked at the group of people assembled in her hallway with the guarded, careful expression of someone who has learned that gatherings in her space usually signal the approach of something unwanted. She looked at Alexander. He looked at her. There was a bit of silence. Then she said, "You were on the lane." He said, "Yes." She looked at Caroline, who gave a small, steady nod. She looked at the legal documents Pauline was holding. She looked back at him. He said, "You don't have to stay here." She was quiet for a moment. The house was very still. Through the kitchen window, the garden was bright with the morning light. "Where would I go?" she asked. It was not a dramatic question. It was an entirely practical one. She had lived inside these walls since childhood and she did not know how the world beyond them functioned, and she was not too proud to say so clearly. "Somewhere that belongs to you," he said. She looked at the soil on her hands. She looked at the roses through the kitchen window, the ones she had grown from cuttings in a garden no one else had thought worth caring about. She looked at Claudette, who was very pale and very still and was watching Alexander with the expression of someone observing a structure they built with considerable care beginning to fall. "I need to get my notebooks," Serafina said. He said, "Of course." She walked through the kitchen, down the corridor, through the doorway of the small room she had occupied for years. She went directly to the desk, lifted the corner of the loose floorboard, and removed 6 soft-covered notebooks, filled from first page to last with her own handwriting. She held them against her chest. She looked around the room once. The window with the view of the gate. The small bed. The desk with its scratches. The bolt on the outside of the door, which would be on the outside of this door long after she was gone, unmoved, entirely useless. She did not feel sad, precisely. She felt the way you feel when you have been holding your breath for a very long time and have only just noticed that you were doing it, and you release it slowly, and the air that comes in after is ordinary air but it feels like something rare. She walked out and did not look back. At the front door, Claudette tried once more, something about rights, something about process, the formal language of a person attempting to reassemble a case that has already come apart. Pauline handed her the legal document and explained what would follow. Claudette took the paper in both hands and her expression moved through several things in rapid succession before settling on a cold and composed anger that she seemed to decide was the most dignified of her available options. Portia had appeared at the top of the stairs. Lenora was somewhere behind her. They looked down at the scene in the hallway with the blank expressions of people watching something they do not understand but recognize as significant and irreversible. Serafina did not look up at them. She walked out through the front door into the morning, and the gravel crunched under her feet, and the gate at the end of the drive stood open, both half swung fully back, held that way by the weight of whatever had just happened, and the lane beyond was bright and ordinary and entirely indifferent to how long she had been waiting to reach it. She stopped at the gate. She did not cross immediately. She stood at the threshold and breathed the outside air, which smelled of cut grass and road dust and distant rain, and she felt the fact that no one behind her was about to reach out and pull her back. She had not understood, until this moment, how much of her energy had gone, every day, into preparing for that possibility. Alexander came to stand beside her. He did not touch her. He did not say anything encouraging or formal. He simply stood beside her the way you stand beside someone who is about to take a step and wants company more than assistance. She stepped through the gate. Her foot came down on the lane on the other side and she kept walking, unhurried, and he walked beside her, and neither of them spoke for several seconds. She said, "I've never been on this road." He said, "What do you think of it?" She looked at the lane, at the curve she had watched from her window for years, the curve she had never been able to see around. "It goes somewhere," she said. "It does," he said. She nodded, and held her notebooks a little closer, and kept walking. Behind her, the gate stood open. Ahead, the lane curved and disappeared, the way all roads do, into the ordinary world. The woman who opened the door of the townhouse on Caldwell Street had kind eyes and the manner of someone who had long ago finished being shocked by anything and had decided to spend the remaining energy on being genuinely useful. Her name was Dame Leora Hastings. She was 63 years old and had spent 4 decades in family law and advocacy, and she had seen enough of what human beings did to one another, and to the most vulnerable among them, to have both no illusions and a great deal of patience. She looked at Serafina standing on her doorstep, the notebooks held against her chest, the cord belt, the careful and evaluating expression of someone who has learned not to trust new situations automatically, and she said, "Come in, then. Breakfast is already made and I expect you're hungry." Serafina was, in fact, very hungry. She had not eaten well in years, partly from a simple shortage of food and partly from the long-established habit of making herself small and quiet and requiring as little as possible. She sat at Dame Leora's kitchen table and ate a full breakfast without anyone telling her to slow down or consider whether she was asking for too much, and the experience was so simple and so overwhelming at once that she spent the middle part of it looking out the kitchen window at the back garden in order to give herself somewhere to look that was not the face of the person across the table. Dame Leora asked her nothing that morning. She fed her and showed her the small room that would be hers, clean, with a window facing east and a shelf above the desk and a key to the lock on the inside, and she pointed out the bathroom and the laundry and said that the house had no rules except basic courtesy and honesty, and that if Serafina needed anything at all she should say so. Serafina said, "I'm not used to asking." Dame Leora said, "I know. We'll work on it together." The days that followed were strange in the way that freedom is always strange when you first encounter it after a long absence. Serafina found that small things affected her more than large ones. The first time she opened her bedroom door from the inside and walked into the corridor without requesting anyone's permission, her hands were shaking slightly and she was not entirely certain of the reason. The first time she went to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea without being told she was allowed to, she stood holding the warm mug for several minutes before she drank it, as though expecting someone to tell her to put it back. Dame Leora noticed these things and said nothing, which turned out to be exactly the right response. What she did do was bring Serafina books. Not recovery literature or guides to rebuilding your life, she was too experienced and too sensible for that. She brought novels and histories and a large illustrated volume on garden design that she had ordered specifically because Caroline had mentioned the garden at the estate, which she left on the kitchen table without comment. Serafina found it the next morning and picked it up and did not put it down for 3 hours. The notebooks from the estate she arranged on the shelf above her desk with care, spines outward. She did not open them for a full week. When she finally did, she read them from the first entry to the last, 6 years of her own careful handwriting, the record of a life being lived under constraint but lived nonetheless, observed and noted and maintained. She felt many things reading those pages, and she did not try to name all of them or process them quickly, because she was slowly learning that feelings did not always require immediate categorization. Sometimes they simply needed to be allowed to exist and then permitted to settle. She found the entry about the convoy. She read it twice, slowly. Then she turned to a clean page in the newest notebook and wrote something new, about the kitchen table, the cup of tea, the unlocked door, the strangeness and the quiet rightness of a morning that belonged entirely to herself. Alexander visited on the 8th day. He arrived without advance ceremony, a single car, a brief message to Dame Leora that morning, and Serafina was in the back garden when he appeared at the rear door, which was exactly where he might have predicted she would be. She had already begun working on Dame Leora's flower beds. The beds had been neglected for several seasons and had the characteristic overgrown emptiness of something that had been left without intention. She had started at the far end, clearing and assessing with the methodical patience of someone who understands that the first work in any garden is understanding what is there before you decide what should replace it. She heard the back door and looked up. He was wearing a navy coat and no tie. He looked, she thought, more like an actual human being than he had in the hallway of the estate, where the formality of the situation had sat on him like an additional layer of clothing. "You have soil on your face," he said. She touched her cheek. "I know," she said. "I usually do." He sat down on the old wooden bench at the far end of the garden without waiting to be invited, which might have bothered her if it had been anyone else. With him, it did not. He watched her work in silence for several minutes. She had found, in the week since leaving the estate, that she was more comfortable with extended quiet than most people were. Years of involuntary solitude had at least given her that. "How are you finding it?" he asked, after a while. She sat back on her heels and considered the question honestly, the way she considered everything. "Strange," she said. "The quiet here is different. Before, the quiet came from being excluded. This is quiet because nothing is being required of me. I don't entirely know yet what to do with the difference." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I understand that more than you might expect." She looked at him. "You? Being in a position where everything is required of you constantly is not so different, in some respects," he said. "You are still only functioning. Still performing a role rather than being a person. The noise is louder, but the isolation is similar." She looked back at the flower bed. "Who gave you permission to say something that perceptive at this time of the morning?" He looked at her. And then he laughed, not the measured, socially appropriate version, but the real kind that arrives before you have time to prepare for it, that comes from somewhere unguarded and does not apologize for it. She had made him laugh, and she found that she was pleased by this in a way that surprised her with its simplicity. Not because it was a performance she had managed. Because his face looked better when it did it, and she was glad she had been the cause. He came back 2 days later. And 3 days after that. They talked about many things: books she had read from the estate library, questions she had accumulated over years of observing the world from behind glass and now had the opportunity to ask properly, things she had noticed about how the city worked that did not match her expectations formed from second-hand information. He answered her questions without the careful simplicity that people sometimes used when they assumed you had lived in a limited world and were therefore limited yourself. She noticed this and was grateful for it, though she did not say so. In return, she asked him real questions about his work, not the polite, safely vague questions that most people offered, but direct ones: what kept him awake, what he had found impossible to explain to his own counsel, what he believed his role actually was beneath the formal description of it. He answered with a candor that appeared to surprise him as much as it did her. He had opinions and private doubts and a genuinely complicated relationship with the position he had inherited, and the more honestly he expressed them, the more she trusted him, and the more she trusted him, the more she said that was honest in return. She did not perform anything for him. She did not attempt to be charming or careful or easy to be around. She had spent too long performing absence to have any interest in performing presence now. She was simply herself, curious, precise, inclined toward dry observation when something struck her as absurd, genuinely engaged when something merited it. He found this entirely disorienting, and then entirely necessary. One evening, as the light was going and they had been talking for 2 hours without noticing, she said, "You always look like you're managing a situation. Even when you're sitting still and there's nothing to manage." He said, "Do I?" She said, "Like a man who has forgotten the meeting ended an hour ago and is still preparing his next point." He said, "I'm not sure I know what to do when the meeting ends." She turned a page in the garden design book she had been holding throughout and said, without looking up, "I am learning. You could borrow some notes." He did not say anything to that. But the silence between them was warm rather than uncomfortable, and that was its own form of progress. What neither of them knew was that the world had already taken notice. A photograph, taken from a passing vehicle by someone who happened to have a phone and was curious about why a black car was parked outside a residential address. A sighting mentioned in passing in a column. A question spreading between readers and viewers who followed such things, asking in the collective, insistent way of a public that loved its leader but loved the story about him even more, who was the young woman who had appeared, quietly and with apparent regularity, in proximity to the king. The question was growing. And very soon it would become loud enough to reach even the quiet of a garden on a weekday evening, where two people were learning something about themselves and each other that neither had expected and neither quite knew how to name. But that evening, the noise had not arrived yet. The garden was still and warm. The birds were coming back to life under careful hands. And Serafina was sitting in a place that was beginning, slowly, to feel like it might one day belong to her, not because someone had given it to her, but because she had earned the right to be in it, and she knew the difference. She pressed her palm against the earth. That was enough. For now, it was entirely enough. The photograph appeared on a Tuesday morning, and by noon it had spread to places Serafina had no way to anticipate. It was not dramatic, that was the strange thing about it. It showed two people in a garden. One was kneeling beside a flower bed, walking, with loose dark hair and soil-marked hands. The other was sitting on a bench reading something. The image was not close enough to see faces clearly, but the man's profile was recognizable to those who paid attention to such things, and several 100,000 people paid attention to such things. By the following morning, the photograph had been placed next to a 2,000-word piece by a columnist who had drawn a number of conclusions from very little evidence and presented them with considerable confidence. By the end of the week, the piece had been picked up by television news, and Serafina's name, which Caroline had mentioned in a preparatory briefing that one journalist had apparently obtained, was attached to the story. Dame Leora brought a tablet to the breakfast table with the careful expression of a person who has been expecting something difficult and has decided that being the one to deliver it calmly is more useful than allowing the person to encounter it alone. Serafina read the main piece once, carefully, the way she read everything. It described her as a mysterious companion of the king, appearing from nowhere, with an unknown background. It used the words sudden and secretive in ways that were technically accurate and thoroughly misleading. It implied that there was something suspicious about a person who materialized, seemingly without history, near someone powerful. She set the tablet down on the kitchen table. Dame Leora poured more tea and said nothing, waiting. "It is strange," Serafina said, "to be described by someone who has never met you. I was invisible for years, and now I am the subject of speculation, and neither state was one I chose." "No," said Dame Leora. "They make it sound like appearing from nowhere is something I arranged. As though I selected a dramatic entrance." She looked out the kitchen window. "I was in a locked room. I came out of it when someone opened the door. That is the whole story." "Yes," said Dame Leora. "I'm not going to disappear again," Serafina said. "I've done that. I don't know how anymore." "Good," said Dame Leora. "Eat your breakfast." Serafina ate her breakfast. She had started landscape architecture evening classes 2 weeks after arriving on Caldwell Street. Dame Leora had found the program and mentioned it without pressure, and Serafina had gone to the first class with the same quiet determination with which she approached most things. She was, it turned out, naturally and significantly gifted. The tutor, a direct woman named Frances who had no patience for vagueness, told her after the third session that her spatial instincts were unusual and that she should think seriously about taking the accelerated track. Serafina had said, "I have been thinking seriously about things for years. I am very good at it." Frances had laughed and said, "Good. You need it." She had found, in class, something she had not known she was missing, the experience of being among people who were interested in the same things she was, who asked questions with the same relentless curiosity, who were willing to argue about soil drainage and negative space and the relationship between a garden and the person who uses it with a genuine engagement that she found both energizing and startling. She had made 2 acquaintances in the class. Not friends yet, she was careful about the distinction and had found that she could not rush it, but people whose presence she looked forward to. A man named Callum who had the deliberate, observant quality of a former engineer and a wonderful instinct for structural planting. A woman named Nell who laughed easily and had opinions about color that were worth arguing with. She did not tell them about the estate. She did not tell them about the lock, or the notebooks, or the convoy on the lane. She told them her name, and that she had been out of circulation for a while, and that she was making up for lost time. Callum and Nell accepted this without interrogation, and she was grateful for it. The press coverage continued to grow. A second piece appeared, this one attempting to construct a background for her from fragments of public records, a birth certificate, a school enrollment that ended abruptly at 15, a property record for the estate. The piece stopped short of saying anything outright false, but its arrangement of true facts created a picture that was misleading in every important way. Then came Claudette's contribution. She did not give a direct interview, the legal proceedings pending against her made that inadvisable. But fragments of a private conversation between her and a close acquaintance found their way to two separate publications within the same week. These fragments described Serafina as troubled and volatile, as a young woman who had required exceptional patience and management, as someone whose history was complicated and whose claims were not entirely reliable. One piece used the phrase, deeply unstable history. Serafina read this standing at the kitchen counter. She felt the old pull as she read it, the familiar voice that said, "This is what you are, this is what people will believe, you are too much, you cause problems, it would be easier for everyone if you stayed small." The voice was old and she knew its address, and she knew, by now, that it was not telling the truth. But it was still there, and it was still her voice, and she was not yet far enough from the room to pretend otherwise. She stood with the feeling for a moment without pushing it away. She had learned that pushing it away only moved it, not out but further in, where it did more damage. Then she thought about what was true. What was true was, she was not volatile. She was not unstable. She was a person who had survived a decade of deliberate erasure and had done so by being more careful and more observant and more internally consistent than almost anyone she had met since. She had filled 6 notebooks with evidence of her own sustained thinking. She was building a new set of skills with her hands. Yesterday she had made Nell laugh so hard during a break in class that Nell had nearly spilled her tea, and Serafina had felt something warm and uncomplicated at having caused the laughter. Something she was starting to understand was the feeling of being present in a life that was actually hers. She put the tablet down. She opened her notebook and wrote, "What is true matters more than what is said. I know what is true." Then she went to class. Alexander read the press coverage in his office with Oliver present, which was unusual enough to tell Oliver something was being processed. He read both pieces from beginning to end. He looked out the window at the city. He looked at the pieces again. He said, "She was confined in a room. The reason she has no visible public history is that she was deliberately kept from one. The implication that there is something suspicious about her appearing without background is the most precisely inverted version of the truth I have read in some time." Oliver said nothing. Alexander said, "I'm going to speak to this publicly." Oliver said, with the careful neutrality of a man trying to be useful rather than obstructive, "The communications team will want the opportunity to." "I know what the communications team will want," Alexander said. "I am going to address it anyway." He did it the following morning in a press briefing that several members of his team learned about 7 minutes before it began. He stood at the briefing podium without notes and spoke for 4 minutes. He described, plainly, what had happened. A young woman had been confined and isolated under fabricated pretexts for years. The government had investigated, the evidence was documented, and legal proceedings were underway. The young woman was now living freely and rebuilding her life. She was not a mystery. She was not a source of speculation. She was a person who had been wronged by someone close to her and who was now, finally, free to live without that wrong being done to her any further. He said her name. Clearly. Once. As though the simple act of saying it in public was itself a statement about her right to be known as a person rather than a subject of other people's narratives. He answered 3 questions from the floor with the direct, informational tone of someone who is being transparent because it is right to be rather than because it is easy. The 4th question, an insinuation, thinly disguised as an inquiry, about whether his personal interest in the case went beyond the official. He looked at the journalist for a moment without speaking. Then he said, I think that question already knows its answer, and closed the briefing. In Dame Leora's kitchen, Caroline played the briefing on her tablet while Serafina sat across the table. Serafina watched it. She watched him say her name. She watched the 4 minutes of it play through. When it ended, there was a short silence. Serafina said, "He said it correctly." People always stress the wrong syllable. Caroline said, "He did not look like a man who was going to get it wrong." Serafina turned back to her tea and said nothing else for a while. But her expression, as she held the cup, was different from the expression she had been wearing before the briefing played. It was quieter. It was the expression of someone allowing something in rather than holding something at a distance. Dame Leora arrived from the other room and sat down and said, briskly and with complete deliberateness, "Who wants more toast?" Everyone wanted more toast. Claudette appeared in court 6 weeks after the investigation concluded. The proceedings were handled with the thorough precision that the volume and quality of evidence warranted. They fabricated medical assessments. They falsified guardianship documents. They extended, systematic confinement of a person who had no legal or moral basis for being confined. The doctor whose signature appeared on several of the assessments gave his own testimony in a steady voice and did not look at Claudette at any point during it. Serafina did not attend. She had given her full, detailed account to the investigators in the weeks before the hearing and had been told by Pauline that her presence in the courtroom was not legally required and was entirely her own decision. She had thought about it for 2 days with the same careful patience she brought to everything, and she had decided that she did not need to watch the verdict being reached in order to believe that it was happening. She had said everything that needed to be said. She had said it clearly and she had said it once. She did not need to be in a courtroom to confirm that the truth she had been carrying for years was real. On the morning of the verdict, she was at the community garden behind a school on Massa Road, one of the projects her landscape architecture program had placed her on. She was on her knees in a section of the south bed, marking planting positions with small wooden stakes, her boots muddy, the spring morning clean and mild around her. Her phone rang. It was Caroline. She listened. She said, "Thank you." She ended the call. She stayed on her knees for a moment in the soil of the garden, her hands resting on her thighs. She thought about the locked room. She thought about 6 notebooks. She thought about the roses she had grown from nothing in a garden that no one else had cared about, and how they had kept growing season after season because they were simply meant to. She put the phone in her pocket, picked up her trowel, and got back to work. The south bed needed attention. The light was good. She had 2 hours before her next class, and there was a great deal of growing left to do. Alexander came to the garden on a Thursday evening in late spring. She had not been expecting him that day. She had learned, in the months since Caldwell Street, that he did not always give advance notice, not from carelessness but from the private understanding they had reached, which was that she did not want to be prepared for him. She wanted to simply encounter him as herself, without the small adjustment that advance warning invited. He had accepted this without debate. She was on her knees beside the new rose bed on the south wall of the school garden, pressing small wooden stakes into the ground to mark planting positions. She heard the gate and looked up, and there he was in his navy coat, slightly out of place among the compost bins and growing trays, in a way that she had stopped finding incongruous because it was simply what he looked like when he was in her world. "You found it," she said. "You described where it was 3 weeks ago," he said. "I'm slow, not inattentive." She returned to her stakes. He came and crouched beside the bed and looked at the layout with the genuine interest of someone who had paid attention to her descriptions over many months and now had actual context in which to place them. "Dark reds," she said, tracing the line of stakes with one finger. "Almost black red. Climbing whites along the upper section of the wall. The contrast will be very strong when it blooms." "That is the intention." "It will be striking," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's the point." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is something I have wanted to say to you and I have been taking longer to say it than I should have." She looked at him. He was, she had come to know, a man who was very precise in formal situations and considerably less controlled in private ones when he was trying to say something that was genuinely true. He looked, right now, like a man in the second category. He said, "You have never asked me for a single thing. Not for help, not for access, not even for extra time or attention beyond what you were willing to give equally in return. You have simply been entirely yourself in every situation and regardless of what I might or might not represent, and I want you to know that I understand how rare that is. And I want to tell you that I..." He paused. He said, "I find it extraordinary. You are extraordinary. Not because of what happened to you or because of what you survived, though both of those things are true. Because of who you are now, today, in this garden, with your stakes and your plans and your absolute refusal to be anything other than what you actually are." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "You took a long time to say that." He said, "I told you I was slow." She returned to the rose bed. She pressed one stake a fraction deeper into the ground and checked that it was upright. She said, "I am not experienced with being seen. You should know this. I am still learning what it means to be in the world in a way that is visible to other people, and it is sometimes difficult, and I will not always manage it well, and I cannot promise to be consistent because I am figuring things out as I go and I am only at the beginning of the figuring." He said, "I am not asking you for consistency. I am asking for exactly this." She looked at her hands. At the soil. At the line of stakes she had set. She said quietly, "I have spent my whole life in situations that were not of my choosing. I would like to choose something. For once, with full information and without any pressure in either direction, I would like to make a choice." He said, "That is the only kind I would want." She looked at him then, directly, the way she had looked at him through the iron gate on the first morning, without looking away or adjusting the look for politeness or protection. "Then I choose this," she said. Carefully. At my own speed. With the right to change my mind if I discover a reason to. He said, "Those are entirely reasonable terms." She said, "They are the only ones I have." He nodded. And then he sat down on the ground beside the rose bed, in his good coat and his proper shoes, in the working dirt of a school community garden on a Thursday evening, and she turned back to her planting, and the city moved around them with its usual indifferent bustle, and neither of them needed to say anything more. The interview she gave came 3 months later. She gave it to one journalist, a woman named Faye, who had covered the legal case with accuracy and without the particular kind of dramatic invention that made Serafina's name feel like a headline rather than a person's name. She gave it on her own terms. No photographs of the garden. No questions about Alexander that were personal rather than factual. A clear agreement that the piece would contain what she said and nothing constructed from implication beyond it. They sat in Dame Leora's kitchen, because it was the room Serafina was most comfortable in and because Dame Leora made excellent tea and had the tact to be in the next room rather than hovering. Faye asked her what she wanted people to understand. Serafina thought about it for a moment with the serious patience she gave to all real questions. "That it was ordinary," she said. "What was done to me did not require anything extraordinary. It required one person with access and patience and a willingness to maintain a consistent story over many years. I want people to understand that because I think it happens more than anyone recognizes, and I think the reason it is not recognized is that people expect harm to be dramatic. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is very quiet." Faye asked what she wanted for herself now. She said, "My work. I am going to be a landscape architect and I have opinions about it that I am only beginning to put into practice, and I intend to keep going until I have expressed all of them. I want to fill more notebooks. I want my tea when it is still hot and my gardens in every season and the particular feeling of something growing because I gave it the right conditions." Faye asked, carefully, if there was anything else. Serafina looked at her. Then she said, "Yes. But some things don't need to be part of the article." Faye understood this and respected it and moved on. The piece ran the following Thursday. It was precise and fair. It allowed Serafina's voice to be what it was, direct, dry, thoughtful, unsentimentally honest, without imposing a narrative around it. It was read widely, and not because it was dramatic, but because the voice in it was unmistakably the voice of someone who had figured out what was true and was simply saying it, without apology or performance. Serafina read it once, decided it was fair, and set it aside. She had a project deadline for the following Monday and a section of the Massa Road garden that needed replanting before the weekend. On the last evening of the spring program, she stayed at the school garden until the light began to go. The rose bed was planted now. The dark reds had gone in along the lower section, the climbing whites along the wall, exactly as she had marked it out. In a few weeks they would begin to establish. In a season they would be exactly what she had imagined when she first pressed the stakes into the ground. She stood back and looked at the bed. She thought about the garden at the estate, which she would never see again and did not need to. She thought about the lavender along the far wall that had grown because it was meant to, regardless of whether anyone was paying attention. She thought about 6 notebooks and a loose floorboard and a window that looked out on a lane, and the morning she had finally, with 2 feet and a full step, crossed to the other side of the gate. She thought about how long it had taken. And then she thought about how little that mattered now, because she was here and the ground under her was real and the work in her hands was real and the future in front of her was entirely and finally her own. She picked up her bag and her trowel and walked through the gate of the school garden, latching it behind her with the easy certainty of someone who knows that the things she has planted will continue without her constant presence, because she gave them good conditions and that was always the whole of what they needed. Alexander was parked at the end of Massa Road. He had developed this habit over the weeks without either of them formally establishing it, appearing at the end of the road on evenings when her sessions ran long, not to escort her or to make any particular statement, but because she had once mentioned in passing that walking alone in the city after dark was not something she had yet fully made her own, and he had heard this and simply started being there. She fell into step beside him. He said, "How did the rose bed turn out?" She said, "Exactly right." He said, "What's next?" She said, "Dinner. Reading after. I have a meeting in the morning with my placement coordinator about the summer program." She had been accepted onto an accelerated track that would take her to 3 different cities across 15 weeks, working on large-scale public green space projects under established landscape architects. The application had been Francis's idea. Serafina had written it herself, in one sitting, because she had been practicing for years and the words came when she needed them. He said, "Are you looking forward to it?" She thought about the question with the care she gave all genuine questions. She thought about 15 weeks. 3 cities. Ground she had not yet touched and plans she had not yet made and the very specific pleasure of arriving somewhere new with a notebook and a trowel and the knowledge that she knew what she was doing. She thought about leaving and returning and the particular confidence of a person who has finally discovered that they are capable of both. "Yes," she said. "Very much." The city moved around them, the evening pulse of it, ordinary and real, people going home to their lives and their tables and their own ordinary choices. She walked beside him through it without anxiety. She was not performing his. She had it, the way you have something only once you have stopped trying to hold it and simply let it be present. She did not look behind her. There was nothing there that required her. Every door that mattered was open now, and she had walked through all of them, and the road ahead was exactly what the road beyond the estate gate had always appeared from her window to be, long and curving and unhurried, going somewhere she had not yet seen, belonging entirely to wherever she decided to take it. She kept walking. Her notebooks were in her bag. Her plans were in her head. Her hands still carried a little of the good dark soil from the Massa Road garden. She was, at last, in every ordinary and extraordinary sense of the word, free.